Hello everyone, I'm finally back with another video, and this time I'm going to show you guys how I made the MK11 version of Ermac, which isn't my first time making him. My very first costume was a version of Ermac, and this was before I knew anything about EVA foam or even how to sew, so I used fabric glue to put everything together. As you can see in this side-by-side image, I've progressed so much. So without further ado, I hope you guys enjoy the video.
We are Ermac. Get over here!
As always, I needed to make a template, so I wrapped my body in cellophane and duct tape, drew on my starter design, and transferred over to my mannequin to finish up adding tape and paper as needed, and keep drawing until I was happy with the design that I came up with. Once everything is done, I cut it all out, and as you can see, I just represented the left side since it will be mirrored over towards the right. After that, I transferred my rough template over to paper to refine that template, and I will be using that going forward. Starting with the back, I traced my template onto some fabric that I had. I traced the left side, mirror it over towards the right, and repeat the same process for an additional piece of fabric that I sandwiched a bit of interfacing in between to bulk up my material. Once I had my fabric sandwiched, I sewed it all together. After sewing around the fabric, I went back over and added some detail lines by just sewing in place, and once that was done, I wrapped the outer perimeter in gold trim and just sewed that up as well. I sewed on a piece of fabric for the front just to test the fitment, and once I was happy with how everything sat on me, then I connected additional pieces from the sides connecting towards the back. I decided to change up my colors from black to maroon, so I made a new template on that maroon fabric and just sewed that on top of that black one. Here I'm cutting out the cape-like portion that attaches to the main torso. I then took that template, traced it over to black fabric, cut that out, and sewed it on to the torso. This was my progress so far. I did make a mistake for the center portion of the vest, and it bothered me enough to where I just didn't want to let it sit there, so I removed it and cut out a new one and sewed it back on. Next, I used my template to transfer on this detail panel that wraps from the back all the way to each of my side, and I'll go over the perimeter of this one as well with gold trim and sew it on just as before. To maneuver around the corners of the fabric, I cut a slit into the ribbon itself about halfway through, fold it over onto itself like you can see here, and sew it on. With the gold trim on, I clipped this little piece of fabric on to kind of test fit everything. So once everything's clipped, I can finally start sewing everything together. So, as you can see, all this is still loose. So once I sew this to the original black piece, that'll finally make a complete system here. And then I can finally sew this on top, and there's a sash that goes in the back that I'll sew to this. I cut out some long strips out of my red fabric, and I'm going to line the edges with gold trim, which I'll then use as a detail piece to go around the edge of the cape piece. Back here is the line that I want to cut, but I'm not going to cut that yet. So I'm going to have to cut a section up here where this piece meets. So I have to cut an angle here, sew all of this in place, and then sew it onto the fabric all the way down. And once everything's sewed on, then I'll make my cuts afterwards. That way they should be a perfect fit. So now that this long ribbon is done, I will do the other side, and I'll start with the short ones as well, which will be mounted somewhere along here. So it'll come across here and kind of work its way down, and I'll make a separate section of this black fabric that kind of overlaps all of this. So I will go ahead and finish up making these and get back to you. Next up, I use my template to create the back sash and just transfer that over to my red fabric and flipping it over to replicate the right side, and went over the edges with my gold trim. Just a quick fitment test before sewing it all together. I used some duct tape to create a pattern on the suit itself and drew on it where I wanted my gold trim to sit. Cut out my template and I separate it from the perpendicular ribbons that are going to be coming across this way. So this is the main body where the ribbon goes all the way around, and I marked where these ribbons are going to be. So I got little marks here all the way through, and now I know where to sew on my gold ribbon. This was my progress so far, and it was at this moment where I realized I need a zipper, which I never got around to adding one. I didn't know exactly where I could really put a zipper and not make it too obvious that it's there, so I just soldiered on without it, but it definitely got harder and harder to put on as I added more and more details. For the collar, I made a inside and outside, so I cut out this black fabric out twice, and I'm going to sandwich in my iron-on interfacing in between. So once I have this secured, then I'll be able to sew on this other half and hopefully install it onto my suit. I clipped on the collar to double check the fitment before sewing it in place. To make the hood, I bought a pattern set from Joann's. I believe the brand is called Simplicity. But all I did was just use that and upscale it a bit. I clipped my two pieces together, which are actually inside out, and I folded the outside edges that your face comes through so I could have a nice clean edge. Once the hood was done, I unfolded it and flattened it and taped it off so I can make a template off of that so I can add on the red detail that goes on top. Once it was done, aligned with the gold trim, I positioned it on the hood and sewed it on. With everything in position, I added on these little fabric tails that I attached to the hood, like so, just to give it some extra bulk so I can sew the ends in the front, on the sides, and of course I got the extended piece on the back that I'll sew to the fabric itself, so I'll make everything into one piece. I made another template for the arm portion, which I started out with paper, transferred it over to fabric with a little bit of interfacing in between, and sewed it all together. Just like everything else on this costume, I needed to add gold trim, so I added that to the arm pieces as well. Once I had both sides done, I hand sewed them in place before finishing up with the sewing machine once I had everything positioned the way I wanted it. To create my front sash, I started out with a paper template that I transferred over to fabric. I cut that out twice and added on my interfacing in between. Once that was done, I sewed in the outer perimeter and went over the panel lines that I traced with my sewing machine so I can get that design that I wanted. And once that was done, I went over and added the Velcro at the top and on the underside of the suit itself so the sash can be removable. To replicate the torn look at the bottom, I traced that detail with my Sharpie and just went over with the sewing machine and cut it out. So of course, to start the arm portion, I made a quick template on my arm by wrapping cellophane and then duct tape. And as you can see here, I made little notches where a pseudo belt will be that'll wrap around the back side. You'll see the other end. And there's another one here. So it just follows all the way around. So you can see just scribbles what I was trying to go for, but made new lines where I felt needed. And I'm just going to cut this out. And of course, you transfer it over to your cardstock or cardboard or whatever you have, make a template and transfer it over to fabric. So I'll go ahead and do that now. So with my arm pieces completed, which consist of my fabric, stiffer interfacing, and my gold trim, I used tape to kind of get a good idea of how long I need my straps to be. And once I'm happy with what I got, I transfer that tape over to leather. To make the jewels that are on top of my fists, I bought a 2-part resin kit from Hobby Lobby and a green pearlized powder that I'll mix in with it. I've already poured out my resin and activator, and I just mixed in my pearlized powder and just mix them all together. To couple these together, I applied a layer of contact cement on both pieces, waited until it was tacky to the touch, and applied just a little bit of super glue and pressed them all together. Going back to those arm pieces, as you can see, I've already installed those straps that I was talking about, and you can see I added Velcro as well. And I found a belt buckle set online, I believe Amazon, that I brushed with gold and just glued those on. Here are the completed arm pieces. To make my template for the boot covers, I wrapped my leg in cellophane and duct tape while wearing the shoes I intend to use with it. And once I had that done, I just made a marking on the front and back where the middle is and around the bottom half of the shoe and just cut them out. Also, when I traced that template onto my fabric, I added about a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the fabric. So once I sew my two pieces together, it should line up perfectly. Once I had my 2 halves and bottom sewed up, I can unfold it right side out, and that will give me my first leg. After finishing that boot cover, I put it back on, applied more tape so I can make a pattern off of that so I can add on more details. I transferred my template onto my red fabric, flipped it over to create the other side, and once I had that one piece done, I went over the edges with my gold trim, just like you see on my other foot. And once all of that was done, I pinned everything in place using my wonder clips in the back and a set of actual pins along the sides so I can prep it to be sewed up later. So this has been a pain to sew together. So to make this a bit easier, I cut this in half. In the back, I just removed the seam, and to take its place, I'm going to install a zipper. So I'm going to fold in these edges here and put the zipper in between, just like that. So I'll go ahead and try to sew that up together and show you what it looks like. This is the upper portion of the boot cover. This is a standalone piece that goes over the boot, so it keeps everything in place. And this is made with the same red fabric, but 2 pieces sandwiched over a thick layer of interfacing and obviously lined with the gold trim and sewn all together. On the inside, I made a strip of Velcro that's going to go in between. So there's a layer of contact cement on the fabric as well as the Velcro, and once it's nice and tacky, I can stick everything together. Now I just need to add gold trim from here to here. So I'll just make a line leading up to it. And I will finally have one done and then work on the kneecap. Here I'm just test fitting my gold trim before I sew it on. I took my original knee template, transferred that over to cardstock, and transfer that onto HD foam, 6mm foam to be exact. And of course I made a left and right side and did a straight cut all the way around and heat treated it with my heat gun. After heating up my foam pieces, I placed them over my knee to force a curve into them. Once I had all of my knee pieces shaped, I applied a layer of contact cement on both sides, waited till it was nice and tacky to the touch, and carefully glued them all together. Next, I used a 15mm foam triangle piece to outline the border of the knee. Next, I applied a generous layer of spray adhesive on the knee, and once I was nice and tacky, I applied a layer of my red shiny stretchy fabric and used my finger to smooth it out to reduce as many creases as possible. Once the fabric and the glue got to know each other, I drew on a pattern that I intend to cut out and replace with a layer of acrylic so I can have the knee light up later. I then traced my template onto acrylic, making it just a bit bigger so it can fit properly into the foam crevice, and once that was done, I sent it over to my bandsaw so I can cut it out, and after that I use high grit sandpaper to scratch up the surface so it'll diffuse the light once the lights are installed. I later airbrushed the acrylic so it can have a nice subtle green hue, and after that was done, I cut out another layer of foam with a layer of fabric on top of that and placed that on top of the acrylic and then glued it all together. I cut out a few pieces of Plastizote and glued that on top to cover the hole and glued some LEDs on top of that. And as you can see, I just included a power source and selected the color I was going for, so in this case green, and I just left the wires exposed so I can include a battery and switch later. And finally, I applied some Velcro on the back of the knee and was able to attach that to the rest of the leg. To wrap up this portion, I sewed on my Velcro on my leather strips, glued those on, and I added my fake buckles as a nice bit of detail on top of that. And after that was settled, I glued on my lights to finalize everything. This was just a quick test just to see how everything would fit on me, and I love the way it came out. To make my glove, I made a paper template of my hand, transferred that over to fabric that I made a larger outline of for seam allowance, pinned it all in place, cut it out, and sewed it along that seam line. Once it's all sewn up, I just unfold it and there you go. Easy peasy. Needed to make some extra details on my glove, so I wrapped my fingers in tape, drew on my pattern, cut it out, transferred over to cardstock, and just cut that out so I have a hard template to transfer over to foam. Once all of my pieces were cut out, heat shaped, ready to go, I painted them all silver and used contact cement and a little bit of super glue and glued them directly onto my glove. Now my end result is a pretty cool glove, so I just repeated the same process for my other side. This was my progress so far after putting everything together. This was the last big piece of the costume, so to make this I used my typical method. I just taped over my existing costume, drew on my pattern on that tape, transferred that tape to cardstock, and from cardstock to foam, and cut everything out. I did cut out a pattern for my jewel in the middle, as you can see here, and that will be half foam, half epoxy, so just enjoy the overall montage. With my base completed, tape it back up and get another pattern off of that. With everything cut out, I just need to sand them down to get the shape that I'm looking for. As you can see here, this piece is cut at a 45-degree angle, but on the back you'll see I have a line drawn across. So what I'm going to do is draw another line in the middle, kind of cut out that line, and meet at the back side where that line is. So when I glue on this raised piece, it'll have a hovering look when it's glued over that base. It's kind of hard to explain, but you'll see more throughout the montage. This is the upper chest portion with a hole cut out so I can install my painted acrylic piece. This is Ermac's center jewel thingy. The outside will be transferred over to foam, while the inside jewel itself will be transferred to acrylic, and it'll be cut along those lines. And I'll use my heat gun to soften up the material and glue it along the lines using plastic cement, which just brushes on to the plastic itself, and it'll help it fuse. And I'll use that as a mold to pour in my epoxy. With the outer piece cut out, I use my X-Acto blade to score in those panel lines, as you can see here. So when I hit it with a heat gun, those lines open up, adding a little extra detail. With everything completed, I can start routing my LEDs. After letting my jewel cure overnight, I glued it on using contact cement and a little bit of hot glue around the border. I bought a few sheets of rubber sole material. I just cut them out and glued them on the bottom of my shoe covers. I wanted to make some extra detail pieces, so I made out these little subpar triangles and just used my Dremel to make, extra little designs for this triangle to go on top like that. Glue that on. I got some foam dowels that I cut up, as you can see here, and I used a toothpick to make a pilot hole and used the end of my paintbrush to kind of widen the hole a bit more, and this will be used to attach on the back like this, so I could put a string through it and glue it onto the suit itself. After gluing all of those details together, I just hit it with a heat gun to seal it and painted over it with gold. Cut a hole at the top of the fabric, as you can see here, so when I put on my foam armor piece, the wires for the LEDs will route through that hole and connect with the leg pieces. For my connections, I bought some servo connectors and I just soldered them to the LEDs and just added a power source, so the 9-volt, and added a switch. Since my 3D printer broke on me, I bought this beautiful mask off Etsy from Mox Designs, and all I did was add the black strips and it was good to go. Finally, here is the completed costume. I had a lot of fun making this and learned a lot when making this, but I know it's been a while since I posted a video, but I hope to have more videos put out pretty soon. But until then, I'll see y'all in the next one. I appreciate you all watching. Y'all take care.